Somewhere in the Idaho wilderness, in 1906, a man named Charlie Reams stood alone on a wooden platform 30 feet above a roaring creek. Behind him, 10 million gallons of water pressed against a wall of stacked timber. In front of him, a narrow canyon dropped away into shadow. His job was simple: pull a single iron pin, then run. Charlie had done this 17 times before. He knew exactly how long he had: about 4 seconds. Maybe 5 if he was lucky. 5 seconds between pulling that pin and being swallowed by a man-made tsunami carrying enough force to shatter granite. He wrapped his fingers around the cold metal, took a breath, and pulled. The dam didn't collapse, it exploded. 10 million gallons of water that had been building pressure for 3 weeks detonated through the breach like a cannon shot. A wall of water 15 feet high launched down the canyon at 20 miles per hour, carrying with it 2,000 logs that had been floating peacefully moments before. Charlie Reams ran. He scrambled up a ladder bolted to the canyon wall, boots slipping on wet rungs, the roar behind him drowning out his own heartbeat. He made it to the safety platform just as the first logs screamed past below, tumbling end over end in the white chaos. He'd survived. Again. But here's what most people today don't understand about splash dams. Charlie Reams wasn't some daredevil. He wasn't performing a stunt. He was doing his job, a job that thousands of men did across America for nearly a century, a job that built this country's cities, framed its houses, and fueled its growth, a job that required men to deliberately create catastrophic floods, then ride those floods down mountain rivers, armed with nothing but wooden poles, and the desperate hope that today wasn't the day their luck ran out. This is the story of splash dams, the man-made floods that moved America's timber, and the men who died making them work. To understand why anyone would deliberately flood a river, you have to understand the problem that American loggers faced in the 1800s. The trees were in the wrong place. The forests that built America weren't convenient. They weren't sitting next to cities or railroad lines or navigable harbors. The biggest, most valuable timber in the country grew in the most inaccessible terrain imaginable. The white pines of Maine clung to rocky hillsides, miles from any road. The Douglas firs of the Pacific Northwest towered in valleys so steep that mules couldn't keep their footing. The western red cedars of Idaho stood in wilderness so remote that it took weeks just to reach them. And these weren't small trees. A mature white pine could stand 150 feet tall and measure 6 feet across at the base. A single tree might weigh 40,000 pounds. Getting one of those giants from a mountainside to a sawmill wasn't just difficult. It was, by any reasonable standard, impossible. There were no trucks. The internal combustion engine wouldn't be practical for logging until the 1920s. There were no bulldozers, no heavy equipment, no helicopters. In most logging regions, there weren't even roads. Building a road through mountain terrain cost more than the timber was worth. But there was one thing these remote forests almost always had: water. Mountain streams carved through every valley. Creeks and rivers flowed downhill toward civilization, toward mills, toward markets. Water moved in the right direction. Water didn't need to be fed or rested. Water didn't charge by the mile. The problem was that most of these mountain streams were too small, too shallow, or too seasonal to float heavy logs. A creek that raged in spring might be a trickle by July. A river deep enough in one stretch might turn to rapids in the next. Nature had provided the highway, but it only worked a few weeks per year. So loggers decided to fix that. They decided to store water, save it up, then release it all at once in a controlled catastrophe that would scour everything downstream and carry their logs to market. The splash dam was born from desperation and perfected through death. The concept was deceptively simple. Build a dam across a stream. Let water accumulate behind it, along with the logs you've been cutting all winter. When you've stored enough water and enough timber, open the dam all at once. The resulting flood picks up every log and carries them downstream faster than any other method possible. Simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. The first splash dams appeared in Maine in the early 1800s. Loggers there had been floating logs downstream for decades, but the rivers were unreliable. Some years, the spring melt came fast and strong. Other years, it didn't. A logging company could spend an entire winter cutting timber, then watch it sit rotting on a riverbank because there wasn't enough water to move it. The solution was to stop depending on nature's schedule and start creating their own floods. If God wouldn't provide enough water, they'd store it themselves. Building a splash dam required no formal engineering. There were no blueprints, no calculations, no inspectors. Men who couldn't read or write designed and constructed structures that would hold back millions of gallons of water under enormous pressure. They did it with axes, cross-cut saws, and knowledge passed down from one logging camp to another. The process started with finding the right spot. You needed a narrow point in the stream, ideally where the canyon walls were close together. The narrower the gap, the less material you needed to span it. You also needed solid rock on both sides. Building a dam against loose soil was suicide. The water would simply cut around the ends and the whole thing would fail. Once you found your spot, construction began with crib work. Loggers built rectangular frames from heavy timbers. Then filled these frames with rocks and gravel. These cribs formed the foundation and abutments of the dam, anchoring it to the canyon walls. Getting the crib work right was critical. A dam that shifted under pressure wasn't just a failed dam, it was a death trap. The dam itself rose in layers. Heavy logs laid horizontally, notched to fit together, stacked like a cabin wall, turned on its side. Between each layer, men packed brush, moss, sawdust, and clay. Anything that would help seal the gaps and slow the leakage. A splash dam was never watertight. Water constantly seeped through the cracks, running dark with tannins from the bark. But it didn't need to be watertight. It just needed to hold enough water long enough. The dams grew surprisingly large. A small splash dam might stand 20 feet tall. Major operations built structures reaching 60 feet or higher. The Clearwater River drainage in Idaho eventually contained the largest splash dam system in America, with multiple dams storing water across dozens of tributaries. The main dam on the North Fork held back a lake nearly a mile long. At the bottom of every splash dam was the trip gate. This was the mechanism that would release the flood when the time came. Early designs used simple sluice gates that could be lifted manually, but these proved too slow and too dangerous. The water pressure on a fully loaded dam made lifting a gate nearly impossible. Men died trying. The solution was the trip pin system. Engineers, and I use that term loosely, designed gates held in place by a single iron pin. Remove the pin, and the gate swung open instantly under the enormous pressure of the stored water. The dam didn't drain, it detonated. The trip pin was usually accessible from a platform above the dam, connected to the gate by a system of wooden levers and iron rods. The dam keeper could stand on this platform, pull the pin, and theoretically escape up a ladder before the flood reached him. Theoretically. Winter was cutting season. From November through March, logging crews worked the mountainsides, felling trees and bucking them into logs. These logs were hauled by oxen, horses, or gravity down to the stream, where they accumulated in the pool behind the splash dam. By spring, the pond might hold thousands of logs, bobbing gently in water that grew deeper every day from snowmelt and rain. The dam keeper watched the water level obsessively. Too little water and the drive would fail, logs stranding on every gravel bar downstream. Too much water and the dam itself might fail, releasing the flood without warning or control. There was no science to this, no gauges or instruments, just experience and intuition. The dam keeper learned to read the seepage, the sound of the water, the way the timbers groaned under pressure. He knew when the dam was ready. He knew when it was getting dangerous. The signal to release came from the head push, the foreman running the drive. When enough water had accumulated and conditions downstream were favorable, word went up the line. Tomorrow we blow the dam. The night before, a release was tense. Everyone knew what was coming. River drivers checked their equipment and said their prayers. The dam keeper made his final inspections, on looking for any sign of weakness, any crack that might signal unexpected failure. Men who had done this 100 times still couldn't sleep. Dawn came early. The river drivers spread out along the stream bank below the dam, each man armed with a peavey, the tool of their trade. A peavey was a wooden pole about 5 feet long, tipped with a metal spike and a hinged hook. It was designed for one purpose: grabbing logs. In the chaos of a log drive, a peavey was the only thing standing between you and death. The dam keeper climbed to his platform. He looked downstream at the men waiting along the banks. He looked upstream at the tons of water and timber pressing against the structure beneath his feet. He felt the vibration through his boots, the constant tremor of all that stored power. Then he pulled the pin. The sound of a splash dam releasing cannot be adequately described. Survivors compared it to thunder, to cannon fire, to the end of the world. One driver, who witnessed the release of the Clearwater Dam in 1911, said it sounded like a train falling off a cliff, except it kept falling and never hit the bottom. The gate burst open and water exploded through the gap with the force of a bomb detonation. The initial jet shot downstream for 50 yards before it even touched the riverbed. Then it hit the rocks and spray erupted 100 feet into the air, drenching everything within a quarter mile. Behind that first jet came the flood proper. A wall of water 15 feet high, traveling at 20 miles per hour, dark with sediment and bark and debris. The leading edge was almost vertical. A standing wave that didn't break but simply bulldozed forward, destroying everything in its path. And in that wave, tumbling like toys in a bathtub, came the logs. A 40-foot log weighs thousands of pounds. In a splash dam flood, those logs weren't floating. They were projectiles. They spun end over end, collided with each other, ricocheted off boulders and canyon walls. The sound of logs hitting rocks was described as rifle fire, individual cracks and booms barely audible beneath the constant roar. The dam keeper had 4 seconds, maybe 5, to get clear. He scrambled up the ladder, bolted to the canyon wall, boots slipping on rungs slicked with spray, not daring to look down. The safety platform perched on a ledge 30 feet above the stream bed, theoretically high enough to be above the flood. Not every dam keeper made it. The records are incomplete, but we know that dozens of men died pulling trip pins on splash dams. Some slipped on the platform before they could start climbing. Some made it halfway up the ladder before a log, launched from the chaos below, knocked them off. Some reached the safety platform only to find it wasn't high enough as the flood crested at unexpected levels. Their bodies were rarely recovered immediately. The flood carried them downstream, battered against rocks, buried under log jams. Sometimes they were found days later, miles from where they fell, identifiable only by their clothing or the contents of their pockets. Sometimes they were never found at all. This was considered an acceptable loss. The flood raced downstream at speeds no horse could match. 20 miles per hour on the straight stretches. Faster where the canyon narrowed. Slower where the valley opened up and the water spread out, dropping its load of logs onto gravel bars and into eddies. Following this flood came the river drivers. These were the men who made the log drive work. Their job was to follow the wave of water and timber downstream, keeping the logs moving, preventing jams, clearing obstacles. They worked in water up to their waists, on riverbanks slick with mud, and on the logs themselves, riding the timber like balance beams while it spun beneath their feet. The tools were simple: peaveys for grabbing logs, pike poles for pushing, cork boots with steel spikes in the soles for grip on wet wood. The skills required years to develop. A good river driver could walk across a carpet of floating logs as easily as crossing a street. A bad one went into the water on his first day. Going into the water during a splash dam drive wasn't like falling into a normal river. The flood carried debris that could kill you in a dozen ways. Logs the size of telephone poles tumbled past at running speed. Branches whipped through the current like spears. Rocks torn from the riverbed became missiles. Even the water itself was dangerous, so churned with sediment that you couldn't tell up from down if you went under. If a man fell in during the peak of the flood, his partners didn't try to save him. They couldn't. The best they could do was watch for his body to surface downstream and hope he was still breathing when they fished him out. Many weren't. The real work came after the main flood passed. As the water level dropped, logs stranded everywhere, on gravel bars against boulders, and in eddies and backwaters along the stream margins. River drivers spread out along the banks, working to free stranded timber before the water dropped too far to float it. This was exhausting, dangerous work. A stranded log might weigh 8,000 pounds. Moving it required leverage, timing, and luck. Men used their peaveys to pry logs free, often standing waist-deep in fast-moving current while doing so. One slip and the log could roll onto them, pinning them underwater. One moment of inattention and they could be swept into the current and carried into the next jam. Log jams were the worst. When timber started piling up against an obstruction, it accumulated fast. A minor snag could become a major jam in minutes, with hundreds of logs stacking against each other in a chaotic tangle. The pressure behind a jam built rapidly as more logs arrived from upstream, driven by what remained of the flood. Clearing a jam required finding the key log. This was the log that had started the whole thing, the one holding everything else in place. Find it, free it, and the jam would break on its own. But finding the key log meant climbing onto the jam itself, walking across logs that were literally shaking with accumulated pressure, knowing that the whole pile could release at any moment. When a jam broke, it happened without warning. The key log would shift, then everything went at once. Logs weighing tons launched downstream like missiles. The entire pile collapsed in a thunderous roar of timber and water. Anyone standing on that pile when it broke was dead. The body count from log jams was staggering. In some operations, 1 or 2 men died for every 1,000,000 board feet of timber delivered. Major drives lost a dozen men in a single season. The Clearwater River drives, the largest splash dam operations in America, killed men so regularly that the company kept coffins on hand at the end of drive camp. These deaths were not memorialized. They were noted in company ledgers, if at all, as expenses. The cost of replacement workers, the price of doing business. No monuments were built, no names were recorded for history. Most of the men who died moving America's timber are simply gone. Their identities vanished with the forests they cut. The rivers paid a price too. Actually, that's wrong. The rivers didn't pay a price. They were destroyed. A splash dam flood didn't just move logs, it scoured everything. The force of the water stripped vegetation from the banks, tore soil down to bedrock, ripped out root systems that had stabilized the channel for centuries. Boulders the size of houses were moved downstream. The riverbed itself was rearranged, pools filled with gravel, riffles blasted into different patterns. This was not accidental damage. It was the whole point. Loggers wanted the stream channel cleared, widened, straightened. They wanted obstacles removed. So they built their dams big enough to do exactly that. The bigger the flood, the more thoroughly it cleaned the river for next year's drive. The first casualties were the fish. Salmon had been running these rivers for thousands of years. Every spring, they fought their way upstream to spawn in the same gravel beds where they'd been born. Every fall, their offspring headed downstream to the ocean. This cycle had sustained native communities and ecosystems for longer than anyone could measure. Splash dams ended it. The dams themselves blocked fish passage. Salmon couldn't leap a 30-foot wall of stacked timber. But even where fish could physically pass, the floods destroyed their habitat. Spawning gravel was buried under sediment. Cold, shaded pools were filled with debris. The precise conditions salmon needed to reproduce were erased, not just damaged, erased entirely. On the Clearwater River, salmon runs that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands collapsed to near zero. On streams throughout the Pacific Northwest, fish that had sustained human communities for 10,000 years vanished in a single generation. Native tribes who had built their entire cultures around salmon seasons watched their food source disappear. They protested, they petitioned, they were ignored. The logging companies had the law on their side. Rivers were considered highways for commerce, and moving timber was commerce. If fish died, if native communities starved, if entire ecosystems collapsed, well, that was the price of progress. The courts agreed. The legislatures agreed. The federal government agreed. Timber built cities. Fish didn't. The environmental devastation extended far beyond the fish. Splash dam floods stripped riparian vegetation that had shaded streams and kept water temperatures cool. Without shade, summer water temperatures soared, killing the insects and amphibians that surviving fish depended on for food. Without root systems, banks eroded faster, dumping more sediment into streams that were already choked with debris. The damage cascaded. Warmer water held less oxygen. More sediment smothered the spaces between gravel where insect larvae lived. Fewer insects meant less food for fish. Fewer fish meant less nutrients cycling back into the forest. The entire ecosystem spiraled downward, each loss triggering others. Downstream communities paid the price. Towns that depended on clean water for drinking found their supplies fouled with bark and sediment. Fishermen who had worked the same waters for generations found nothing left to catch. Farmers whose irrigation systems had been fed by mountain streams discovered their ditches clogged with debris. The logging companies paid nothing. There were no environmental regulations. There were no liability laws. The rivers belonged to everyone, which meant in practice they belonged to whoever could exploit them fastest. By the 1890s, the devastation was becoming impossible to ignore. Rivers that had once supported thriving fisheries were now sterile channels of gravel and mud. Forests that had seemed inexhaustible were showing signs of depletion. The most accessible timber was gone, and reaching what remained required building splash dams in ever more marginal drainages with ever less water and ever more risk. The industry's response was not to stop. It was to scale up. The Clearwater River system in Idaho became the proving ground for industrial-scale splash dam operations. This was some of the most rugged country in the continental United States. Mountain slopes so steep that horses couldn't climb them. Canyons so deep that sunlight reached the bottom only at midday. Wilderness so remote that supply runs took weeks. But the timber was extraordinary. In white pine trees that had been growing since before Columbus landed, trees so large that a single trunk might produce enough lumber to build a house. The Clearwater drainage contained billions of board feet of the finest timber on Earth. Getting it out would require the largest splash dam system ever constructed. The Clearwater Timber Company, later absorbed by larger corporate interests, began building dams in the 1900s. They didn't build one dam. They built dozens. Every significant tributary got its own dam, each one feeding into the next like a cascade of controlled catastrophes. The main stem of the river got multiple dams, staged so that each release would boost the next. The logistics were staggering. Thousands of men worked the Clearwater operations, living in camps scattered across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Supplies came in by pack mule train, days of travel from the nearest railroad. Equipment that couldn't be carried by animals was built on site from whatever materials were available. Medical care was essentially non-existent. A man injured in the backcountry either recovered on his own or died. The main dam on the North Fork of the Clearwater was the crown jewel of the system. It stood over 60 feet tall and held back a reservoir nearly a mile long. When full, it contained enough water to create a flood visible from miles away, a wall of brown destruction that announced its coming, with a sound like continuous thunder. Releasing the main dam was an event that drew spectators. People traveled from across the region to watch the controlled apocalypse. They lined the ridges overlooking the river, keeping what they hoped was a safe distance, and waited for the show. The dam keeper climbed to his platform. The same ritual that had played out on 1,000 smaller dams now reached its ultimate expression. The same moment of decision. The same 4-second window between action and consequence. The same knowledge that this might be the day something went wrong. He pulled the pin. The North Fork release was described by witnesses as biblical. The wall of water that emerged from the breached dam defied comprehension. It filled the canyon from wall to wall, carrying logs that looked like matchsticks in the chaos. Spray rose hundreds of feet into the air. The ground shook for miles in every direction. The flood raced downstream at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour, gathering tributary streams as it went, each junction adding volume and power. By the time it reached the main Clearwater, the wave had traveled over 20 miles and grown to dimensions that seemed impossible outside of natural disaster footage. Logs emerged from the floodplain like whale bones, thousands of them scattered across gravel bars and trapped in eddies for miles downstream. The river drivers who followed the flood worked for weeks to free the stranded timber, men dying in the effort as they always did, their names recorded only in company expense reports. The Clearwater drives continued until 1971. They were among the last splash dam operations in America, holdouts in an era that had moved on to trucks and railroads. By then, the technology that had built the country's cities was already being dismantled, the dams dynamited to restore fish passage. Albeit the damage acknowledged even if it could never be undone. What killed splash damming wasn't environmental concern. It wasn't worker safety. It was economics. Railroads reached into country that had once been accessible only by river. Logging trucks grew powerful enough to haul timber over roads that would have been impossible a generation earlier. The internal combustion engine did in 20 years what rivers had done for a century. And it did it without the seasonal limitations, without the deadly drives, without the need to store water and risk catastrophic releases. By the 1920s and 1930s, most states had passed laws restricting or banning splash dams. Some of these laws were motivated by environmental concerns. Salmon advocates had been fighting for decades to protect what remained of the runs. But mostly the laws passed because the logging companies no longer cared enough to fight them. They had better options now. Let the rivers recover. The timber was coming out by truck anyway. The rivers didn't recover. Not really. Decades of splash dam operations had fundamentally altered stream channels, destroyed riparian forests, and eliminated fish populations that had evolved over millennia. Some rivers eventually regained a shadow of their former productivity. Others never did. The salmon runs of the Clearwater, once among the largest in the world, were reduced to hatchery-dependent remnants that bear little resemblance to the wild runs that fed native communities for 10,000 years. The men who worked the splash dams faded into memory even faster than the dams themselves. Their names were never recorded in public monuments or official histories. They died in logging camps and were buried in unmarked graves on hillsides that have since been logged over twice. Their skills, passed down through generations of river drivers, became obsolete in a single decade. By the 1950s, there was no one left who knew how to build a splash dam or run a log drive. The only record that remains is in old photographs and company archives, if you know where to look. Pictures of men standing on impossible structures, dressed in wool and suspenders, their faces serious beneath shapeless hats. Pictures of walls of water carrying timber through narrow canyons. Pictures of devastation presented as progress. And scattered across the mountain west, if you know what to look for, you can still find the remains. Crib work foundations crumbling into streams, anchor bolts rusting on canyon walls, ponds behind failed dams, slowly filling with sediment and growing over with willows. The bones of an industry that built a nation and left nothing standing. This is what we owe those men. Not just the river drivers who died in log jams, not just the dam keepers who pulled trip pins and ran, all of them, the men who felled the trees with axes and crosscut saws, the men who hauled logs with oxen through mud that sucked the boots off their feet, the men who lived for months in remote camps, eating beans and salt pork, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high. They didn't do this because they wanted adventure. They did it because it was work, and work was scarce, and their families needed to eat. They took risks that would be unthinkable today because the alternative was starvation. They died in numbers that would make a modern safety inspector weep, and nobody counted, and nobody remembered. The timber they cut built the cities where we live today. The lumber from those mountain forests framed houses in San Francisco and Chicago and Denver. The boards that came down those rivers in splash dam floods became walls and roofs and floors for millions of Americans who never knew and never asked where the wood came from. We live in their houses. We walk on their floors. We close their doors against the weather and never think about the price that was paid to put those doors in place. That price was paid in human lives, in rivers destroyed, in salmon runs that will never return, in ecosystems degraded beyond recovery, in communities displaced and cultures erased. The full accounting would be impossible because the records weren't kept and the witnesses are gone. But the debt remains. The next time you look at an old wooden building, something from before the age of trucks and chainsaws, think about how that lumber arrived. Think about the mountain stream, dammed by hand, the water stored for weeks, the pin pulled by a man who had 4 seconds to live or die, Think about the wall of water carrying logs through canyon after canyon, and the men who followed that flood with nothing but wooden poles, betting their lives that today wasn't the day the river would win. Those men built this country. They did it with their hands and their backs and their willingness to face death daily for wages that wouldn't cover a modern parking ticket. We owe them more than we can pay. But we can at least remember. If you want to understand how America really built itself, how the labor that created our modern world actually worked, hit subscribe. Because this is what I cover: the forgotten industries, the impossible jobs, the men who did what had to be done and were never thanked for it. I'll see you in the next one.